Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love alongside my co-host Shamika Michelle and Wilfred Riley. And our guest this week is Rabbit. He is a statistics guru and well-known vat of information on Twitter. Rabbit, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, I'm sure we'll get to your unique look at some point, but I wanted to start off by finding, I know you have a large following and a lot of people like and dislike the types of things that you tweet, which seems like just simple empirical information. But I want to get started with how you got started, like why you did that, if it started on Twitter or before, but what made you start digging into the numbers and talking about and explaining to people what it means.
Sure, absolutely. So I think I was relatively apolitical for a large chunk of my life. Like I would kind of try to pay attention, but I also don't think I was super invested, right? And even now, like, I try to avoid being overly obsessed with the 24/7 news cycle because my sentiments on that is that, a story's gonna be gone in like a day or two, right? But instead I try to focus more on like reading up on the issues themselves. So in my case, like I really started getting more invested around 2020 because obviously COVID happened, right? And when I saw the lengths that governments were going in the West, I kind of had a moment where I was like, all right, I should probably get a bit more invested. I should probably start reading up on some of these issues. And I started seeing things that just didn't make sense. Like, when COVID first began, everybody was told to shut down and stay indoors. And then, obviously there was a tragedy with George Floyd, and then health officials kind of backtracked and said, okay, if you're protesting, the virus will magically not hurt you. The virus will magically stop spreading in these large Black Lives Matter protests. And I said, okay, this doesn't make sense. So I started looking more into things, and then I started talking more with my personal acquaintances. And long story short, I read a lot of Thomas Sowell. God bless Thomas Sowell. He's a great, absolutely. For anybody who thinks I'm a vat of knowledge, I'm nothing compared to Sowell. So absolute legend. So I read a lot of Sowell, and then it just so I shared an oral quote yesterday. So that quote was something like, the best books tell you what you already kind of know, right? So in the case of Sowell, he kind of confirmed some things I suspected, but he laid them out in a way that made sense. Like he had the facts to support them, and that's what kind of drew me to him. And I started reading more of Sowell. I read a few of his books now, and I really appreciate his perspective. And then I kept talking about these things with my personal acquaintances. And then one day my wife said, hey, you talk about this stuff a lot. You text about it a lot. Why don't you just try tweeting about it and see where that takes you? And then that's when I made my Twitter account. I made it, I believe, January of 2022. But I didn't really start using it till April of that same year, April, May. And then, I started off being a reply guy for Wilfred, and then things kind of snowballed from there. And now here I am talking to you guys. So, this is absolutely surreal because like 2 years ago, I was basically an NPC, and now I'm talking to some cool people. So, yeah.
Well, I'm glad to be considered amongst the cool people like Will and Shamika. But yeah, I didn't realize that you had, I followed you, but I didn't realize how late you had started. So you went from just starting to tweet in 22 to what are the 400,000 Twitter followers, and Elon Musk saying this is the guy to go to if you want stats in just over a year.
I guess, yeah. Yes, like right now I'm sitting at about 390,000. And then the thing with Elon that happened, so Elon first replied to me in November of 22. And then because that's when there was that drama with Apple and Tim Cook, because for some reason Elon suspected that Apple was threatening to take Twitter off the App Store for political disagreements, right? Like I'm not sure how credible that rumor was, but that's what the premise was, right? So I replied to that tweet from Elon with a chart showing that Apple, their employee donations are mostly to the Democratic Party. And I said, well, I can see why Apple might do that because there's a lot of pressure. There's probably some internal pressure, right? And then Elon replied to that and said, concerning. And then that tweet went absolutely viral. It was like my first viral tweet, got like almost 70,000 likes, millions of views. And then And then like, after that, like, sort of a light bulb, a switch went off in my head, and I sort of realized like, okay, I have about 6,500. So before that tweet, I had 6,500 followers, and that boosted me up to about 15,000, right? And I sort of realized I'm like, okay, I think I have good ideas, and I think I have stuff that's worth hearing, but so I should try to reply more to these big accounts like Elon and see if that brings me more attention. Because I mean, before then, like I mostly stuck to the threads of Wilfred's and of monitoring bias. Sort of like that extended IDW type crowd, right? So I started replying more to Elon, just trying to like share, nothing spammy, like I would, but like I would try to like provide stuff that I thought that he was interested in, stuff that I thought was relevant to his original post, and then over time, things just kept snowballing, and then I got here. And then in regards to the Elon follow itself, so Elon tweeted, I think it was in mid-December, follow Rabbit. And I don't think he was referring to me. I think it was like an Alice in Wonderland Monty Python reference, but as a joke, I replied saying thank you for the shout out. And then I guess some people took it seriously. And then my following exploded from like 20,000 to like 80,000. And then Elon, including Elon, and I was like, wait, what just happened? And then that I so and then I started 23 with like almost 100,000 followers and not sure what to do with them. So, I've just been doing my best to learn, navigate this landscape ever since then. Hopefully not make too many mistakes, but yeah.
And last thing, was it mostly stats right out the gate, or did that kind of morph into that? Because a lot of the stuff I see is, somebody will make some crazy comment, and then you give them information why it's true, why it may not be true, why it makes sense, what they're leaving out. So was that always the method?
That's the way I tried to go about it because and this kind of goes back to what I was saying in the beginning. Like I don't I like lately I've been trying to be better about following the news, but like I don't like the 24/7 news cycle because it's very sensational, it's very emotional, stories are developing, right? So like I try to provide broader context. Like, so if for example, we hear a story about an unarmed black man getting murdered by police officers, like, it's obviously a tragedy, right? But like I also try to be like, okay, well, it's also a statistical rarity. And I think there's an agenda being pushed where the statistical rarity is what's getting the focus instead of the innocent black people who get murdered on the streets, right? So
right. Okay. Will, since you are one of the people he followed to get to where he is now, tell me what you think, and ask whatever you may want to ask.
Well, I feel proud. I feel like I played a role like a dad watching it. No, I mean I think it's cool. There's been a whole wave of these sort of statistical accounts kind of taking off on social media. And to some extent that was always the case. I mean, you've had people from Tim Weiss on the left to Steve Saylor on the right that have really just kind of crime stat nerded it, that have just talked about race relations and all that. But like recently, you've seen people. Fintasil is one that comes to mind, who's a yogi that's good with numbers, who breaks down all this crime data. There are a bunch of them. There's Swan Marcus, who's more of a liberal, who's pretty anti-alt-right and does a lot of international numbers. There's a Cremel, if I have the French pronunciation correct, who looks at it kind of hereditarian, looks at a lot of like twin studies and so on. So you have all these people that are probably like junior faculty members that have put on kind of noms de guerre and are arguing with each other. So you have like true liberals, and you have kind of genetic hereditarians, and you have intellectual dark web guys who can be either. And I mean, in general, I think this is a pretty positive thing. And I don't agree with all of them. I mean, I'm a quantitative culturalist myself, but again, the idea that you can have these conversations on like Twitter or Facebook is something pretty new. I guess my question for Rabby, or whatever the shorthand for the rabbit hole would be, is what are you getting a backlash to this? I mean, as you get to 500,000 followers or something like that as a data source, I mean, do journalists get in contact with you, or do people try to shut you down, claiming racism, like what or something? What are the interactions with the surrounding world if you actually have an audience on par with a TV channel or a good sized newspaper?
Sure, absolutely. And then I just want to quickly say, like, you can absolutely take some of the credit for this because when I first started, like, not a lot of people want to interact with a random bunny account that has 0 followers, right? So just the fact that you did, there would be no rabbit hole without Wilfred Raleigh. So, like, much love to you, man. Thank you so much. And yeah, I just want to give full credit where it's due. So, and then now to answer your question. So, in regards to like any hate, backlash, like, and I guess the question is also in regards to my mental health, right? Like, I honestly just ignore it. just because I knew going into this that the stuff that I was wading into was going to be controversial, and even in my personal life, it's been controversial. Like I've had disagreements with friends, loved ones, and luckily I chose my loved ones and friends wisely, so it never escalated to anything crazy. But it gave me an idea that this stuff is gonna have some blowback. So I just don't let it bother me too much. Like usually like if a thread gets crazy, I'll just mute it and move on to something else. Because outside of Twitter, I do have a 9 to 5 job that I got to focus on as well, and I got family, personal affairs, so I don't want to get sucked into too much negativity. So, and then in regards to people calling me racist or calling me these labels, like my general sentiment is basically Hitchens razor, right? Like that which is asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence, right? So like if you're calling me racist, like either prove it or shut up. Like I really don't care. Like you're going after me because I'm sharing. Usually it's because I'm just sharing some inconvenient data, right? And it's and I think the approach should be like, okay, is this data legitimate? If it's not, then fine. Like maybe I should reconsider sharing it. But a lot of times it's that the data is legitimate. You just don't like that I'm sharing it. So, and instead of refuting the data or arguing with it, you're just calling me a racist, hoping that's going to shut me down because you're hoping that I'm afraid of the cultural stigma that comes with the label. But unfortunately for you, I'm not. So I'm just going to tell you to shut up and go screw off, right? So those labels don't bother me that much. And what was did I address the entire question? I think there was a third part that I forgot.
Well, it was essentially just what's the interaction you get as
Right.
this
So
kind
do
of
any
citizen.
journalists or anybody, right?
Yeah, as citizen journalism. So the idea of citizen journalism has become kind of a contested hot phrase. Like most people I know that work in the mainstream media hate the idea that there are these people that are going online that are talking, and I think me, Charles, and Shamika all get this to some extent, but that are just going online and that are saying, hey, I'm a junior stats professor, this is what I think, and like linking a meme. That draws fury. So I mean, my question really was pretty open-ended. It was just like, is that something that's happening to you, and how do you react to it? And it sounds like it is, and you're just pretty nonplussed by it.
Yeah, I think that's an accurate summary of what I said. And like and then in regards to the journalists, like so far I haven't really had journalists try to hit pieces on me. Maybe I will at some point, but nothing that I'm aware of. Like there was a guy from New York Times, or maybe he's ex New York Times now. He wrote like a 30-page Substack article just losing his mind after the after that there was a weekend in May where Elon responded to myself, Ventisol, and Wokeness, and a bunch of other accounts, and just was interacting with crime data. And this guy lost his absolute mind and wrote this huge essay saying like, "Oh, I'm Ventisol's dog handler," or something. Like, yeah, I forget
Carnival Barker.
Yeah, Carnival Barker. I thought the term was offensive, but then I looked it up and it wasn't as offensive as I thought. So like that's a place where I jumped the gun and I shouldn't have. So, but it was like a pretty big meltdown, and I thought that was absurd. It was Seth Abramson. I just remembered his name.
Yeah,
But
well,
other than that, like I haven't had too much journalist blowback yet. And in regards to citizen journalism more broadly, I think some of the criticisms that legacy media gets are valid, and I think some of the criticisms that citizen journalism gets are valid, right? And I think the best sort of or the ideal scenario is to have like larger institutional outlets exist and have citizen journalists exist and kind of have them serve as a system of checks and balances on one another, right? Like it shouldn't be that there's one unchallenged narrative. It should be like, okay, like we're all collectively pursuing the truth. Let's work, let's not necessarily work together, but like let's have like those checks and balances. So like the pursuit of truth is prioritized, and we're kind of getting closer to that instead of just pushing propaganda or a singular narrative.
Right. Shamika, I'm sure you're probably a fan of citizen journalism, but what do you think about that, both from a standpoint of people being able to speak about issues with no guardrails? The people who work, whatever you think about MSNBC or Fox, you say the wrong thing, they'll fire you, but as a citizen journalist, you can do whatever. But at the same time, it must be something powerful about it with the social media presence, because we're seeing people who are not either doing both, leaving their mainstream to go on their own, like the Barry White Substack, Glenn Greenwald, Andy No. Like a lot of these people are, and Tucker now, even though it was somewhat forced, are at the point that they can do the media and do this job. They were traditional journalists, but they can do the job without any big name, big company over them and do things the way they want to do. So how do you think that comes to play?
How do I think it comes to play? I
Yeah.
think that is something that's necessary. I do feel like in the last 3 years that, or maybe a little longer than that, maybe about 5 years, if it hadn't been for these type of accounts or these type of people, there are a lot of things that I would not know, or, things I maybe would believe differently, especially during COVID when you watch so many accounts get shut down. It was just nice to have these new people popping up, because it was like when one went down, you would have this other account that would pop up and give you information, maybe even where that account left off, or just something totally different. And so I appreciate it. What I'm interested in knowing is, you said something about you pick your friends wisely. Does that mean in general, or does that mean as far as who knows that you're the rabbit hole? Because I don't know, I found that I use my regular name, and I'm telling you, I've been uninvited to family events, over the last 3 years, not even because I said something directly to my family member, but because they saw something that I posted online that they didn't like. And so now I don't get the invite. And I'm talking about family that I was really close to, family in town, family that helped raise me, that I no longer get invites to just because they saw something I posted online.
Yeah, and first of all, like, I'm very, very sorry to hear that. Like, that cancel culture is a major poison, and I hope we get past it as a culture, right? And start having more healthy conversations instead of just canceling people over disagreements like this. So genuinely sorry to hear that. In my case, luckily I've avoided things to that extreme, right? And to answer the question directly, both in my personal life and both in terms of who I divulge my identity to, I try to be very careful with who I tell. So when it comes to my Twitter friends, right? If I ever end up in Kentucky, for example, I would probably get Wilford some whiskey and be like, hey, I'm the guy. Thank you for everything. Here's some whiskey. Let's go to a bar or something, whatever he's comfortable with, right? But I probably won't do it, with some random journalist from New York Times, just because I don't know them. And it's also again, going back to Wilford, I think we have some shared sense of camaraderie, because he's been supporting my account for a long time. So I have more trust in him versus, again, a random journal, right? Or even somebody who found my account after the blow up, right? Because I definitely have had some people, who've reached out purely for the sake of getting in touch with Elon, right? They're like, oh, Elon follows you. Can you please reach out to him for me? And Wilford has never done that. He's been a OG supporter and has never asked me for any favors. He's given me this platform. So, so I'm much more likely to indulge him than some random who just wants favors, right? And in regards to my personal life, my parents know, my wife and siblings know. I have some close friends who know, but in general, I try not to talk too much about it. A few days ago, or maybe it was yesterday, sometime this week, there was, I'm in a group chat with some old friends from college, and I have not touched that group chat that much in years. Every now and then I might say happy birthday, for example, but I barely use it, right? And they shared a tweet of mine that had gone viral a few days back, and I noticed, and I'm like, oh, it's, I guess, when something like that happens, it just kind of hits you how wide the scope of the account has gotten, right? Where you don't even have to tell people who you are. Your content is just making a full circle wave and getting back to you in real time, in just natural course of time.
Right. It's like some people check out this guy. You should follow him. You're like, oh, really? Should I?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that is cool. So, Shamika, to the stats, since he's the stat guy, are there any issues? I got a couple here that I'm sure you'd be interested, but off the top of your head, that you think are important because there's a disconnect between either the truth and what people believe is the truth, or what the information says. What stat do you think is
Of course, I would think the stats about, white people hunting us down.
Yeah, they're
But
hundreds.
I kind of know, but I think maybe for the audience, they need to know that we aren't being hunted down, and the stats would actually help them realize that we are not.
Let's
But I
hope.
know for myself personally, I want to know how crime is in America versus crime, say, where they don't have guns. Because when I hear people talk a lot, they reference America like we're just this violent place, and the places that don't have guns have no violence. Like they are just utopias that we would love to live in because there's no violence, there's no racism. It's just great there. And I want to know the stats on those.
Any thoughts on general crime stats in addition to just the policing, but other crime stats, Rabbit?
Sure. And I just full transparency, like I honestly could have spent more time looking at international stats because I focus more on domestic stuff so far, but from like the limited stuff that I do know, like, a lot of the some of the disparities between the United States and European countries, for example, can be explained by gun laws. Like not all of it, but a little bit. I've seen Richard Hanania make that argument in an article, and I think a lot of it, I think some of it is a cultural thing as well. Where it's like there's certain neighborhoods in America, that drive a lot of the crime stats, right? Or the homicide rates. So if you were to remove a few neighborhoods in Chicago, the homicide rate would drop a good amount. So I think some of it is a cultural thing in the United States as well. And then in terms of general stats, I think one of the biggest sort of stats lies that I see is honestly is the legacy media narrative that unarmed Black men are being hunted down in large numbers by police officers, right? And Skeptic did a couple polls on that. I think it was one in 2019, and they released a follow-up in 2022, where they polled people from across the political spectrum, asking how many unarmed Black men do you think were killed by police officers? And there were like a good number of liberals, like over 20%, who were saying, oh, thousands, 1,000, 10,000, like these absurdly high numbers. And when you realize the true number is closer to between 10 and 20, depending on the year, it really gives you an idea of the scope to which how pervasive that false narrative has gone in American culture. And it also gives you empathy for some of these BLM protesters, right? Because honestly, if I thought that 10,000 unarmed Black men were getting killed by police every year, I'd probably be as mad as they are. So I think it's also important to empathize, and realize yes, these people are kind of annoying at times, but they've also been misled. and it's probably better to address the people doing the misleading than the people who've been misled, because in a way they're also being played, like anyone else is.
Well, another thing to the crime stat, though, I know the policing one. Will talks about that poll quite often because it's insane that many people believe that. But there's also, and this one I speak about often because I think it's used differently, but I feel it kind of from both of the sides of the political spectrum, is this violence among Blacks, right? So you'll see people on the right tweet, well, you all need to get this cultural thing in order because 50% of the murders are committed by 13% of the population, meaning Blacks, which they don't understand. That math would imply that all of the Blacks are killing people. So 13% of the US population, which is Black, is committing 50% of the murders. And then on the left, they'll say, well, we need criminal justice reform. And they're implying that the numbers say because Blacks are violent, so the only way we can have true equality and to help them is to just not lock them up. Because if we locked everybody up for breaking the law, there's just going to be a lot of Black people in prison because that's just what they do. And I kindly remind them that the crime stats also say that the percentage of Blacks committing violent crime is really, really low, multiple times that of whites by population, but still a very small percentage. So among Black, you're still talking about less than 3%. So talk about how those stats can be used by the user to make Blacks look more violent than they are, or to try to influence people that the only thing you can do is to let these criminals out of jail.
Sure. I'll address the conservative point first. So the 1360 meme, like I think it depends on how you interpret it, right? Like if you interpret it as like as 50 to 60% of the murderers happen to be Black, that's a valid interpretation. But I think it's also important to recognize, okay, just because 60% of murderers are Black, that doesn't mean 60% of Blacks are murderers, right? Like it's not a two-way relationship like that. Like it's that 60% of murderers happen to be Black, but 60% of Blacks are not murderers. So, like I don't think it's valid to be like to be painting all Blacks in the negative light, right? Like it's so I think that's absurd. And I think like I saw someone tweet this, like like they said that social media has been a PR disaster for African Americans, and I kind of see where they're coming from, because like we see all these videos going viral of incidents in these cities, and like because Blacks are overrepresented in crime for whatever the reason might be, they're overrepresented. Like it paints a I can see how it can paint a negative picture of the entire demographic when, like you mentioned, it's a select few that are committing these crimes. Like I think in New York, they found that it was like maybe a few hundred people of any race, like who commit the vast majority of the crimes. And if they just lock those people up instead of just re-releasing them over and over, then that would reduce crime a good amount. So
yeah, there's that.
Yeah, not to mention it could be the same person sometimes. It might be 3 murders, but 1 murderer. Will, go ahead.
Well, yeah, this actually gets into what I think is a pretty important question. So first, like a comment about what you were saying, Charles. So like when I said I'm a culturalist on human behavior, like I think you can change human behavior by doing brutal things to a fairly small number of people, basically. So, I mean, like, if you're talking about Black crime, I mean, you guys are both referencing that study that found that I think it was like 1,378 criminals, all males, like more than 50% of them Black, mostly young, were responsible for like 2/3 of the crime in New York. I mean, and to some extent, if you killed those guys or threw them in jail for a very long period of time, there's not a joke here. The crime in New York would end. And I mean, in civilized Latin American countries like El Salvador, they're starting to do this. I mean, for a very long period of time, the highest crime countries in the world weren't Black countries. They weren't blonde Eastern European countries. None of the stereotypes. They were Caucasian, Hispanic countries, and that cocaine zone in Latin America. And they got tired of it. So countries like El Sal, Costa Rica, so on, just threw like the most violent 1% of young males in jail. Like you can just Google it, like El Salvador prison population, and now there's no crime. There's a lower crime rate in El Salvador than there is in Frankfort, Kentucky. So I mean, first, like when people say, IQ is this, crime rate is this, you can change that. I mean, so that's one obvious point that no one ever makes. That's, I think, very, very important. In fact, probably the most important point you can make in a human society. But I do have one question for the rabbit hole about this in terms of kind of the presentation of data, because this is something you just notice if you go on Twitter. Like in terms of that IDW kind of stats posting space, there is a lot of focus on like really specific things. Like Black crime is a big one. Like most of the accounts that we've mentioned talk about that like half the time. And there's a response from, and I like all these people, but like, people like Jeff Charles, for example, have started responding from the Black side. Bryson Gray's done this a few times, pointing out that there are crimes that are much more common among whites, or like I've done this actually, no reason to name other people, like mental illness is much more common among whites. 46% of white liberal women tested. Yeah, but I mean, like, I guess what I'm saying is like, is there a point to this? Like, are people pointing out kind of truths that are important to understand, or does this kind of descend into the racial groups trolling each other? Like, is there a right and wrong way to present this data? And does the online debate space have a problem with actual racism? I guess that's a good one sentence way to present that. Is there a right and wrong way to do this? And is there an actual racism issue? Or are people calling attention to important stuff that just isn't being discussed? Like, is that the reason for the annoying repetition? Like, what do you think, genuinely?
Yeah, and I think this is a good way to also answer the second half of Charles's question, because he asked what my response would be to the left and their criticism of this data sharing, right? And I think kind of like what you hinted at, Will, like different groups have different pathologies. Like Blacks kill each other, whites kill themselves. Like we've seen that chart from Fentosil, right? Like it's human tragedy, like, and it sucks. Like I don't want to try to dunk it. Like it's just a bad situation in those areas.
Asians kill the SAT.
Oh man. I think Asians
behind the back. All right, but anyway, like, sorry, just no more jokes. It's a serious topic.
Yeah, no, you're good. but yeah, like I think different groups have different pathologies, right? And like I think and there's no solutions, there's only trade-offs, right? Like I think the trade-off when you talk about these things is yes, you are risking some racial stereotyping, but when you don't talk about these things, like you're also never going to properly address the problem. Like there's no way to really help any community if you're not candidly speaking on the issue, right? Like, and that's why like we see so many dumb solutions from these big cities, right? Like like why would you defund the police when 60% of blacks either want sustained or increased funding? And why would you defund the police? When when I think the correlation is strongest, with reduced police stops, right? Like when you reduce the number of police stops, the number of homicides go up. So it's like why would you reduce police funding, police resources? Like when doing so kills more black people. Like if Black Lives Matter, then why would you do that? Like it just doesn't make any logical sense. And I think some of these dumb policy decisions that we see, they're a result of candid discussion not being had. And so like in regards to the final point, regarding whether having these conversations is racist, I don't think so. I don't think it is. Like I think there is a degree of validity, like of the risk of racial stereotyping and tension. But if we don't have these discussions, I think we're going to end up with we'll just remain stuck in this cycle of trying dumb solutions that don't work. Things get worse, people get frustrated, and then we just blow a bunch of resources for essentially meaningless projects, and nothing will get better in the long term. So I think it's I think at worst it's a necessary evil, but I don't even think it's evil. I just think it's necessary.
I got another topic though. How about implicit bias? Can we fix the Will talked about, you can change the human behavior. Well, apparently Whitey is ingrained with this racism and they can't help themselves, and they just have these beliefs about blacks. And the studies prove that, they react a certain way just because of race and they can't control it. So how do we fix that? Because white people have this implicit bias.
Like in my personal opinion, like I think a lot of implicit bias that gets confused for racial bias, like it ends up amounting to something more class-based, right? Like, like if in my case, like, if I'm walking down the street and I see someone walking up to me, if, I don't care what the race that person is, if that person's wearing a suit, I'm not going to get uncomfortable. If that person is dressed like a homeless person, I'll be a bit more on edge. So I think a lot of times, like, we confuse class variables for racial variables, like in terms of these implicit bias things. And in terms of like, how much implicit bias is worth discussing, like I think when you get really granular and you start thinking about like how racism impacts every aspect of our lives, like I think at that point, like, it's borderline conspiracy theory thinking, right? Like, and it gets a little nonsensical. I read a few excerpts from D'Angelo's book, and like, some of the stories that she tells are just cringy. I don't think any normal person thinks to that extent about race. And I think it's a little too much to, I think when you get into the granular level of implicit bias, like it's so practically useless that I question whether those conversations are even worth having. And with those implicit bias trainings, there's studies that indicate that those trainings increase bias because nobody wants to be put through a training like that. Like nobody wants to be told like, okay, you have this privilege or this privilege, or you're oppressing this person even though you never have, right? So like I think I just think that those implicit bias, especially the trainings, like they do more harm than good. So it's not like a worthwhile endeavor from what I've seen on my end. Let me know if that answers the question. I know.
Yeah, it does. But have you all seen? Will, go ahead.
It's just a quick comment there. I mean, one of my takes on Robin DiAngelo, I've read most of Robin DiAngelo as a social scientist, has always been that she's just a low-key racist. I mean, like, just really project. But I mean, like, you don't want to stereotype it, like, working middle class, like Italian American background, big city, family had some racial issues. I'm not a psychologist, but I mean, like, some of the stories in her book, like where she was talking about it, was being on a date with a black guy and she kept reassuring him she wasn't racist, and like the racial jokes flashing through her mind. I might be getting the narrative a little off here, but she keeps saying things like, well, everyone feels this way. And I think this is how everyone feels about like their personal pathology. Like, no, I'm not quote unquote a slut, quote unquote a drunk, whatever. Everyone's like me. And she just strikes me as someone who's a personal bigot. And a great impact on American society has been caused by this fact. She assumes, and I think Dr. Kendi assumes this, a number of other people do. And many of these people are either white or like Nicole Hannah-Jones, they're half white and from well-off families. I mean, the idea is everyone has these same issues that I do, the same feelings of imposter syndrome or racial prejudice, and we need to drum that out of all of society. And I don't think that that's true for most people. I don't think most people are sitting around on interracial dates thinking of all the black jokes they've ever heard or whatever. So, yeah,
And,
people's personal insecurities can really impact the world.
and speaking of that, isn't this a problem? I think Rabbit called it learned helplessness. I don't know if any of you have
Oh, yeah.
seen this. I see it on YouTube a little bit. I saw it more when you click through Facebook, but it's a guy that it has a big following because he makes these little scenario clips. They're really Hollywood quality, and these little scenarios of racism. So it'd be like the black guy who owns the bank, but he wearing jeans and a t-shirt. And he walks into the bank, and then the overt racist treats him so bad, and then he's like, "No, I'm just going for the meeting. You can't come in here because you're black. Get out of here." But no, but I'm here for whatever. And then it comes to find out that he owns the bank, and then they need to have a conversation. And you watch these videos, I'm like, do they actually believe that normal people, even racists, wouldn't act? The racists and Klans members are watching these videos like, Larry, would you ever do that? No, Bubba, I'd never do that. I mean, it's so over the top. Have you seen? Do you all know what I'm talking about? These videos? You never seen them, Shamika?
Yeah, they also don't have anything to do with racism in the usual sense. Yeah, it's like what you're describing. It's like a guy who's like fully cripped out, like jeans, like blue hoodie, rag,
Right.
will walk into a bank and be treated like he's a bum. And the theme of the video is because I'm black. And it's like, well, no, because you look like a bum. I mean, generally, if I see a guy who looks like an 8-tray gangster in Chicago, a BD, like I'm not going to assume they own a financial institution.
Right.
So I mean, it's like
But they
one of you
also
guys
make the
made
racists so over the top. Like, oh no, look, they go to the
uh,
coworkers and say, Larry, look, there's a black guy. We've never seen one of those in here, have we?
yeah, I mean, that part is silly, but like one of you guys, is Charles, it was either you or Rabbit mentioned the whole implicit bias thing and the difficulty of adjusting for class when you look at like race prejudice. There are actually a couple studies over the past couple of years that have. There's a paper by two guys called Derolia and Kodal that look at the impact of black names if they're not quote unquote ghetto at all. So it's like people that have obviously ethnic last names like Lopez and Blackman and just have regular ass first names like Charles and Will, and they apply for jobs and there's no racism detected at all. So it's difficult to adjust for that, but you have to. Like, it may not be moral, but of course people are going to treat you worse if you're poor than if you're rich in a bank. The question is, are they going to treat you worse if you're black than if you're white? That's not cool. But yeah, you're not going to give a loan to a guy with no money.
Right. Right. I mean,
Okay.
yeah. And then the last topic I have listed here is obviously because of today's ruling, affirmative action. So, will the blacks ever go to college, Raddick?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Wilford did.
I'll make it real easy. Well, Wilford went when they still had affirmative action. Will the next generation of
They
blacks
thought I was
ever go
white.
to college?
Let's be real.
He said they thought I was white.
Yeah, they held up a bag at the door. Like when I went to the University of Illinois, before I could walk in, they had these sacks there, and I just barely passed.
Barely.
Yeah,
Barely.
I had tried to not play ball that whole summer because I knew what was
Then they would have
awaiting
known.
me.
Look,
Yeah.
but really, I mean, just to talk about how insane this overhyped reaction is to the decision.
Yeah, I mean, in regards to like whether blacks will go to college, I mean, we had great black scholars succeed in the university system, like Thomas Sowell, and Thomas Sowell went back. This was before civil rights. This was before affirmative action. Like, and he did just well for himself, and like he's basically like I would argue Thomas Sowell, is like one of the he's a leading figure in like libertarian conservative ideology, and and that's in a demographic that supposedly hates black people. So if somebody like Thomas Sowell can get a good education before civil rights and become a leading figure amongst libertarian conservatives, then I think black people post affirmative action will be just fine. And I also want to comment on mismatch, right? If we are to believe mismatch theory from Richard Sanders, we might even see more black people graduate from university if they're placed at the right university, right? And I think Sowell has also commented on this where I think he was at Cornell, so when Sowell was at Cornell, he observed that, many of the black kids here are smart. They have above average SAT scores. These are smart kids. So why are they struggling? And one of the theories is that they're mismatched. A black kid who struggles at Harvard might do just fine at maybe UCLA. So I think mismatch is a problem that should get more coverage, and we should consider okay, are we actually decreasing diversity by pushing for equity, right?
Mhm.
Because many Black kids who would graduate from a UCLA let's engineering program, if they go to Harvard, they might drop out of engineering and do some frankly useless degree. That's
Right.
not gonna, that's trouble getting a job with, and this and not and is also not very marketable. So I think affirmative action, if mismatch is to be believed, the theory is viable, it might even be a net positive for diversity and for Black people in terms of graduation rates.
Shamika, one of the things that I think is not talked about much, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is an issue. I go to you because you're so blunt on some of these things. So the whole point of college admissions, look at the reactions. Michael Eric Dyson, Al Sharpton, they're all saying, well, now Blacks won't be able to go to college, whatever. But Blacks and whites go to college today in about the same rate. So can we at least be honest, even if it's wrong and it should stay and it's necessary, just be honest. We are not talking about admissions to college. Everybody on this panel went to college, right? All of us that we can see anywhere are Black, right? So, so for we all went to college. What they're really arguing is whether they should go to Ivy League colleges, right? What they're really arguing is, do they have a right to go to Harvard, Yale, and Stanford, right? Then the elite schools. They're not arguing whether they can get into the state schools, right? So why aren't they saying that? If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But if that's true, why aren't they saying that? Why aren't they saying that Blacks have every right to have a proportional percentage of people in Harvard? But they're not. They're just saying Blacks won't go to college without affirmative action. What do you mean they're going to college everywhere? So why are they ignoring that they're really asking for, saying that they have a right to go to a certain type of school that no one really has a right to go to? That's the whole reason it's elite. Most whites don't get in.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we know that they're just dishonest people, and they always have to spin it to look like we are such victims. I can't remember the person that I responded to or quote
Today,
tweet.
right?
Yeah, today.
So Erica Marsh,
And she was who?
was it Erica Marsh?
Yes. And and I was a little bit like, okay, these kids, if they do well in school, will go to college. Like, I never for one moment thought, oh, my daughter needs affirmative action or she's not going to get it in college. She has a 4.43, 72 college credits. Like, she went to high school and did what she was supposed to do after doing what she was supposed to do all through school. If your child is smart and deserves to go to college, they'll go to college. This whole idea that everything needs to be dumbed down, like, I see so many people that probably benefited from affirmative action that don't know the difference between THEIR and THERE. If you don't know that, you have no business in these elite schools. Like, it's just, I think what they want is a crutch. What they want are these kids who have no business in some of these schools being there, so that it looks diverse, so that we look like, we're included. And if you can't cut the mustard, you don't need to be there. Go to your local community college and get your weight up.
Will, what do you think about that? My comments about the Ivies. Is there some difference between them? I mean, because they don't speak about it like it's different, but there is a difference between getting into college and getting into Harvard. And are they just trying to get some kind of privilege that they think that they're owed at these particular universities?
Well, the reason that this conversation doesn't focus on what's actually at stake is that what's actually at stake is totally unsympathetic. I mean, it's a dispute between the white and minority elites about who goes to Yale, and no truck driver in America gives a shit, right? I mean, so like the reality, first of all, like most colleges are non-selective. By that I mean they're not going to let you in if you get an 800 SAT, but like the average, even for blacks and natives, I don't mean even, we're all doing better than we did in the 90s, but even for the lower performing groups, is a 950.
Nines, right.
Yeah, I mean, they're not terrible, but so I mean, if you want to go to like directional Oklahoma University, which is going to be a fine school and a lovely campus, the 75%, but no, not 75% of people don't need to go to college. The top half of both white and black applicants could realistically do that. So what's at stake here isn't whether you can go to a state U or join the military or something like that and make something of yourself as either a white or a black guy. What's at stake is this internal upper class dispute. But because that's totally unsympathetic, it's not something most people care about, the people involved in it kind of have to lie about what they're actually demanding. And by the way, I mean, this is an offshoot of a broader problem that Shamika called out, which is that SJWs always lie. Like almost everything they say is untrue. So, I mean, like the entire affirmative action debate is couched as you are a racist if you don't want to give an explicit race specific advantage to one group, and instead you want to treat everyone equally. To me, I agree with Rabbit. I don't think that the black elite is correct in the assumption that it's going to hurt even the black elite not to go to Harvard and Yale quite as much. Like there are a bunch of studies that find all of these people tend to be very, what here I would call univariate. Like they'll find one difference between races, they'll attribute it to racism. That's the level of their statistical ability because they're not all that smart. But what you actually find is that other stuff like IQ is also really predictive, aggression of where you're going to end up in life. So people who go to Harvard do better on average than people who go to Illinois or Michigan. But that's because on average, they're about 100 SAT points smarter than people who go to Illinois or Michigan. So if you go to Harvard and get some kind of BS affirmative action degree, you actually don't do all that well. I don't think it'll hurt the black upper middle class to have more people go to Michigan and graduate with honors and be thought of as kind of leaders in their class.
Right.
But there are a lot of people that are very leery about that. They don't want to take that risk. They don't want to take that step down. But what they're actually demanding, which is like a set number of seats at like 3 bespoke schools that no one goes to, that just sounds really uncool. So they don't say it. Instead, what they say is things like, are you going to allow in 2023 black people to be kicked out of college? And as always, that's not what anyone's demanding, just like there's no trans genocide, just like there's no wave of hate crimes. I mean, I could go on.
Right. Well, see, that's the reason why I kind of bristle at the way people argue with some of these, because there's a way, I mean, they lie, like Shamika said, they control the narrative in some way. So I'm not saying it's easy, but if you do it with a different approach, kind of like the way Will and the way we do it, then maybe it's a little harder to just kind of dismiss it both as racist or, when you're speaking, fact, this truth that's so obvious, everybody will get it. So I wrote a piece today and Will was kind enough to retweet it. So perhaps as a kingmaker as he is, then I'll be the next super, person on Twitter like Rabbit. But and in that we talk about Rabbit, I wanted to talk about like how people use data. So I tried to use the same stats that they use, but point out how they're looking at them the wrong way. And to education, it just chaps my hide. Do people still say that? That they're saying that they're so focused on this affirmative action, ending affirmative action will be so hard for blacks. It's so wrong. And this is proof we needed. In New York, Stuyvesant, the most elite of the elite schools, just did their New Year's enrollment and only, I don't know, 486 students or somewhere around that. Only 7 of them were black. So that proves that the whole system needs to blow up. Yet, it's also the city with 1 million public school students, many of whom are not reading and do math at grade level, white or black. So instead of using their energy to close that gap and help people learn to read and do math, they're focused on why there's only 7 that are excelling to the point that they can get into the selective enrollment. So aren't they using the data both in a wrong way and also just looking at the wrong thing?
I think so, like because and that's like also my issue with affirmative action, right? Like I think it's trying to solve the problem at the wrong step of the pipeline. Like the reason that we don't have as many black applicants to Harvard is because there aren't as many qualified black high school students. And why aren't there as many qualified black high school students? Because maybe their middle school and elementary school was not done right. So it's like, and a lot of that just boils back to like the schools in many of these cities, like they're for just to be blunt, these schools are trash. Like, and they got worse over COVID because from my perspective, like from what I witnessed during COVID, like it seemed like these neurotic school teachers were prioritizing their own safety, or not even their safety, like just to get a false sense of safety, than the education of these children. And who's the hardest hit by that? Black kids, Hispanic kids, like groups that historically underperformed. They were the hardest hit by the COVID school policies. And And I think part of the reason why they're going after affirmative action is because looking at the public school system would mean admitting failure, and they don't want to do that because it's probably politically inconvenient. It means taking accountability, which the woke don't like to do. And it's weird, and it's funny because like they like to hold everybody accountable, but not themselves, right? And I hope we can change that. I hope we can hold them accountable and get better schooling for some of these kids, because that's a net positive for society. Like, and because I want more kids to go to school, like, and I want more kids to succeed in life. I just think that affirmative action just takes the wrong approach, and I actually think that again, circling back to mismatch, if mismatch is what's actually happening, affirmative action probably does more harm than good.
Right.
So
I think so. I think I don't think people are going to be as hurt by it as they think they are, and I guess we will see. The last topic I want to bring up is child transitions. I want to know, does the stats say that the puberty blockers are just a light switch and everything's fine, and we should just Will's like, let me get it out. Will's like, nope. Should we just pump all the 6 and 8 year olds with these drugs and testosterone, as Will so eloquently put on an earlier podcast about this? Look, I played sports in high school, and I would get kicked off the team for taking the drugs they're giving these girls too at like 10. But that's, what are you finding around that, both the puberty blockers, the number of people who are transitioning or identifying as all these others, and why the detransitioners are being ignored like they're the anomaly when it's a larger percentage of them than there are?
Sure, and I'll address the detransitioner point because it flows naturally from the earlier point that I made. Like, I think the reason that the detransitioning community is being ignored, like people like Chloe Cole are not getting the attention they deserve, is because to give them attention would be to admit failure. It would be to admit like, oh, this stupid thing that we pushed did not work out, and people were actually hurt by it. So just like with the school closures during COVID, detransitioners are getting ignored because it's politically inconvenient, and it's because it would mean admitting failure. It would mean admitting that in some cases children were abused for medical profits, and that's kind of how I view the whole child trans thing. It's like, when you put children on these medical pipelines, like these are lifetime patients. Like, like if you transition a kid when they're a teenager, like they'll be like, people live a long time. So like, that's like a patient for 50 plus years potentially. That's a lot of money to be made, a lot of treatment to be given. So I think there's a profit incentive to go after children, and when it comes to gender ideology and transgenderism, and like in terms of like whether these things can be flipped on and off. Well, just to be blunt, if I chop off my dick, it's not gonna come back, like.
But I think they're trying to claim that the drugs, right? If you give an 11-year-old testosterone, 11-year-old girl testosterone for 2 years or 4 years, so she's 15. If at 18 she stops, she'll be totally fine.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's not true because I've met some of the people, but that's what they claim. It's just what did she say? It's just like a little pause button, and then it can just go back to the way it was.
Yeah, and I think it just takes like a naive view of reality, like, because I think the left and the woke, they like to think that everything's valuable and they can reshape human nature, they can reshape the world according to their utopian vision, but that's just not what it is. Like, if you I think the example is puberty blockers, right? So if you give a child puberty blockers and they do not go through puberty as normal, the example that I like to use is bone density. Like, their bones will not grow the way they should, and they'll be more prone to injuries as they get older. Like, so that's one thing. And secondly, like, other parts of your body will not properly develop. So like, if let's say you put like a teenager on puberty blockers, right? And when the time comes for a medical operation, like, it's not going to go it's not going to go very well, because there's not enough tissue down there to resculpt their genitalia into the opposite sex. And people have died when they've attempted that. It's absolutely horrible.
Right. Will, I know you got something to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a pretty good summary. But so at a certain level, first of all, in terms of the sports comment, yeah, they're not giving these people some new magical wonder drug. What they're giving them is pure T, just steroids. It's like pure testosterone. It's more potent than Anabol and the steroids you'd, get kicked off the tracker basketball team for taking. So, of course, if you give high potency steroids to 12-year-old girls, that's going to have, it's amazing this has to be said, that's going to have really damaging long-term effects. I mean, and a lot of them are bizarre and kind of embarrassing. Like, your clitoris is going to enlarge if you do that. If you take the male hormone and you're a woman, I imagine there could be some upsides to that, actually, if you're through puberty, but like, it's going to get bigger and stay that way for several years. You're going to grow hair. And I mean, human body hair is cyclical. I mean, for at least several years, you're going to have that. You can grow a beard. So you're going to have to shave your beard. I mean, if you get what's called top surgery, which is a voluntary double mastectomy, which starts at 14 or 15, I mean, that removes your breasts and all your breast tissue. So you're never going to get those back. And if you go on something like r/d trans, you actually see this heartbreaking phenomenon of these little girls, these like 16-year-old kids talking about whether their breasts will ever grow back. Because the assumption is that they would keep growing throughout your teenage years. But no, they go in and they take the muscles that underlie those. Like, that's never coming back. So yeah, that comment, like if you cut off your dick, it's not going to return. It's blunt, but it is accurate. And we are doing this stuff to kids. And this is being presented as gender affirming care, caring care, these labels by for-profit medical organizations. And I think this is going to be the next lobotomy. I mean, there's no chance we look back on this as a good thing. I would bet a sizable amount of money on that, and via some of my investments, in fact, basically have. I mean, that's nuts. Another, like, what's the last comment I was going to make on this? Oh, when you said, someone, either Charles or Rabbit, put it very politely, like you might not have enough flesh tissue for the surgery or something like that if you take puberty blockers. What that means is, if you're a male, for anyone, any of the parents watching this, if you're a male and you take quote unquote puberty blockers, the average penis is whatever it is, 6-7 inches. I mean, if you take puberty blockers, you stay at like an inch because you never go through puberty. So there's not enough of your penis left to make your fake vagina. And if you stop taking puberty blockers, you still have an inch-long penis for the rest of your life. And because of that, you're probably never going to have an orgasm. Certainly, if you make your fake vagina, you're never going to have an orgasm, as I understand, because you'll no longer have a penis. Sperm can't come out of it. I don't mean to go on and on about this random kind of creepy topic, but I mean, just like, that's a big decision, fellas. Right. So, I mean, that's something that should be left up to the adults, or not at all. Therapists should block it. But the idea that we're doing this stuff to kids is pretty wild.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was just going to add a quick thing. And there's also the issue of informed consent, right? Like, how can a child make informed consent when they, when they do not understand the sexual nature of a sex change, right? And frankly, if a kid does understand the sexual nature of a sex change, there should be an investigation, because that kid was abused in some way. So like, I just do not see a legitimate legal way that a child can make informed consent. So that's just the last thing I wanted to add to what Will was saying. Thank you.
To add to your ad, I mean, Will did such a great job of painting a picture of the horrors of this, so it didn't really need one. But I'm watching Shamika's reaction, so I want to throw one more on top of it anyway. And to the claims that you could just flip this off, is not a big deal. Transition, because if you don't transition, you commit suicide, all this stuff. There's long-term repercussions to this. We talked to, when Buck was on, he talked about it. And, detransitions, I've met a few, and they're all like, okay, so now I live as my biological gender. So Buck's not living as his biological gender. So it's a biological woman. So he has to take testosterone on a regular basis, even after having surgery, to maintain that beard and that male look, right? And then the flip side, but what people don't realize is, if that person detransitions, goes back to living as a biological woman, now they've thrown out the metabolic balance so much that they have to take estrogen. They just switch what they take. It's not like they just get off of testosterone. Now you have to take estrogen on a regular basis to offset the balance, because they screwed your whole body up. So then there's that too. You okay, Shamika? Anything you want to end there, to ask, mention, or comment on before we go, Shamika?
I would just say, have you seen those created vaginas and penises? Ugh, they are disgusting looking.
Why are you going around looking at fake vaginas and penises?
There's somebody on Twitter who has a really large account that will always put the picture, like she's put pictures up of it. Ugh.
Oh, is it Dr.
Yeah.
Is it?
There are a bunch. It's actually like, it's like Truny Tunes. It's just like feminist accounts that are almost having fun with it. But I mean,
it's like a doctor or somebody, I think.
Oh yeah, I think Dr. Anastasia Lupus, right?
Yes, that's her.
Oh. Wow. Okay, that's
yeah.
The fake vaginas, or the created vaginas, whatever. I mean, they look very painful and are not going to do everything the actual article does. The fake penises, though, I'm trying to be PG-13 here. The fake penises, though, are a different level, because they don't work.
Right.
I mean, maybe I'm just more familiar with the penis than with the vagina. I think I've seen both a fair number of times that I have one. But the penis is not just a flesh tube. It has testicles, it's attached to your body, has sensation. The artificial version is just, I know vaginas do too, but like the artificial version is just, it's like meat from your arm that's sewed to your stomach.
Yeah.
I did see
It's
that
ugly.
where somebody drew
ugly.
lines and then they cut off a chunk
Yeah,
of meat.
it's not even like they make
this.
this artful hole and they line it with stuff and so on. It's just, it's like a tube of meat. Like it can't get erect.
Yes.
I'm not sure
It
what
is
you
so
do with
ugly.
it.
It's ugly. And let me tell you, some penises are very pretty looking. Like they're really nice. They look like you want to taste them. Those
Fine, handsome
do not.
organs.
So, Rabbit, after that, is there anything that we have missed or anything you'd like to add or discuss as we make our way out to the exit here?
The mask is starting to hurt a little bit, so I think I think we could
Take it off. Just take a rip. We'll be ready. Okay, fine.
Like I'll just say this, okay?
It's Alan Dershowitz. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
If my gym bros with body dysmorphia cannot get testosterone, little girls shouldn't be able to either. And that, I think, is my final note. But no, it was a great discussion. Like, thank you so much for having me, guys. And I think we covered, or at least touched on everything that I wanted to talk about. So I do appreciate the platform and hope this is.
Well, we're not at 500,000, but let's get it's at the Rabbit Hole 84. Let's get them up to 400,000. Rabbit, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate you guys.
I got a country to save. God bless the US of A. Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save because I'm Patriot J and I'm saving a day.